You're listening to Secure Ventures, the show that follows cutting-edge founders in the cybersecurity space to understand their plights, glories, and revolutionary products. I'm your host, Kyle McNulty. I'm also a full-time investor at In-Q-Tel, a strategic investor for the U.S. intelligence and defense communities. This show is a personal outside activity separate from and not affiliated with In-Q-Tel in any manner. All comments, opinions, and sponsorships are wholly independent. With me in this episode is Raj Mallempati. Raj is CEO and co-founder of Blueflag, which helps ensure developers only have the access permissions needed for their roles, reducing risk of excess exposure. Raj started his career as an engineer and then in marketing at Adobe and VMware before taking on a COO role at Cloudknox, which they later sold to Microsoft. Raj took his lessons from working with identity at Cloudknox and applied them to designing Blueflag while paying attention to the nuanced differences for the development lifecycle compared to cloud. In the episode, we discuss his core tenets of successful marketing and cybersecurity, the promises and challenges of cloud infrastructure entitlements management, often referred to as CIEM in the episode, which is spelled CIEM, and what Cloudknox was doing, the value of his time as an entrepreneur in residence, and how he's constantly reevaluated strategy at Blueflag, informed by his previous experience. Raj, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Kyle.
Yeah. So take me back towards the beginning of your career. You're doing product marketing at Adobe and then a little bit later VMware. I mean, I would love to hear your perspective maybe to start in terms of what attracted you to product marketing originally. Like, how did you find yourself in that role?
Yeah, in fact, when I started so even before Adobe, right? So I was an engineer by training. A couple of interesting facts about my life before I went to business school and before I went to, what we call the dark side, right? I'm actually an aerospace engineer by education and training. Never got an opportunity to actually become or sort of do aerospace engineering, but I was also a computer science guy and hence a software engineer, right? In multiple companies, especially thankful to be at Sybase. So post business school, a natural extension of what I was doing as an engineer was to be deeply involved in the product, right? So I was doing a couple of things early on at Adobe, doing a combination of both product management and product marketing, right? So the reason I actually got into that broader space of helping shape the product and helping tell the story or tell the message behind the product was primarily because I could take advantage of my skill set, which is understanding the capabilities of any given product. So that's huge. And then the second piece was translating that into core value for the customer. So that's how I actually got started way back when when I was at Adobe. Since then, it's been actually an interesting journey, right? So started with product management, product marketing, then kept expanding the sets of capabilities that I was responsible for, right? At VMware, had the opportunity to work with a phenomenal team, specifically to build up early on what's called the desktop virtualization space or VDI space, and then building up that business over a period of 6 years, right? 6+ years there, right? And there again, the journey was, start with product marketing, but then expanding it to more of, building the business, more like, building the business from an operations perspective, building a business from a channel and sales perspective. Right? So it was a much broader responsibility there. And then Mobile Iron, again, kept expanding that to run marketing plus some of the sales operations elements, right? And look, I was fortunate to have some great mentors across, as I kept building up this businesses. So that's my journey up until at least Mobile Iron. After that, it was a company called Malwarebytes, right? Specifically in terms of expanding that solution over to like the SMB market. And then just before starting Blueflag Security, I was at a company called Cloudknox. Very fortunate to scale that business again, practically from a super small dollar amount to actually building up that entire business, which culminated in a successful exit, to Microsoft, right? So that's my journey up until Blueflag Security.
Yeah, I'm not going to let you abbreviate it to just that level. We'll dive a little bit deeper into the Cloudknox piece of the story in particular. I'm very interested in that. But I also want to take a step back before we move on too far from the marketing piece. Marketing, I feel like there's a lot of different maybe strategies or like philosophies in terms of what makes sense or how a company should think about building their footprint and engaging with the broader ecosystem, whether it's creating like a community that you want to engage with very deeply, or like open source, open core,
Yeah.
or like more traditional mechanisms of like cold outreach and stuff like that, which is maybe almost more sales than it truly is marketing. But another thing that makes this feel especially relevant right now, I'm not sure if you saw the April Fool's joke from Wiz, where they were talking about having a Broadway play for Sizzos,
So,
which, like, to their credit, the level of production value behind it was quite good, to the point that when I first saw this, I genuinely thought that a cyber company had gone so off the rails as to have created a Broadway musical, and what other company would have the budget to actually make that happen. But my point is, this is like a very creative, kind of out there form of marketing that I would say is like much riskier, much less common with like the average cyber company. And I'm curious what your philosophy around marketing has been and what some of the core influences have been for you.
yeah, I mean, my broader story, when I take a step back and I think about marketing, you've got to go do what I call an outside in marketing, right? What I mean by that is understand what segment you're going after. Are you going after the enterprise segment, the mid-market, SMB, or consumer? That's the first thing that you have to think through. And the second thing that you have to think through is what's the persona within those companies or within those types of companies that you are actually going going to go target. Why is that important? Because that will define how do those core set of folks buy your platform or are convinced that your platform is the right solution for what they need, right? And that's the first thing that you have to. Those are the two things that you have to consider, right? So, for example, if you're selling into developers, right, either in the mid market or enterprise, the reality is that you want them to leverage or use your platform. So, an open source strategy makes sense, and then upsell them from an open source platform, right? But if you're thinking about selling to the CISOs or the security team, then it makes sense to typically use a traditional sales or sales and marketing strategy, right? And of course, if it is SMB business, then it makes sense to be sort of more focused in terms of driving a huge volume of transactions and velocity, right? So what I always articulate to people is, first and foremost, understand which segment you're going after, or what type of companies are you going after, and within those companies, who are you targeting. That will define how you want to go to market. That will define how you want to go and drive your marketing strategy, right? And then the second piece, this is something that happens a lot with cybersecurity companies, right? Typically, cybersecurity marketeers or even the go-to-market, they strive on the FUD principle, right? Just sort of highlighting, what's the potential risk or the potential fear, right? Or striking fear, right? Now, that historically would certainly work, and to some extent it continues to work, but that's not necessarily I don't necessarily believe that that's the right way to be actually sort of going about and doing marketing, right? I mean, look, the Wiz CMO, the folks who who are driving the brand, they've done a phenomenal job of differentiating it. I'm sure you've gone to a lot of their booths, etc. That I still remember, right? And again, kudos to Asaf and his team and the entire team for doing such a great job. But I mean, the whole notion of a grocery aisle in a lot of these a lot of these booths. That was actually phenomenal because they stood out significantly, right? Again, that's a very creative way of driving a cybersecurity platform, right? Again, so that I certainly, I'm certainly a big believer that you shouldn't always be using a FUD principle when you're driving messaging and marketing, right? So, get more and more creative when it comes to from a sort of driving the value of a cybersecurity platform. So, two different aspects. Hopefully, I've covered both of them there.
Yeah. To the second point, there's no question that can be a tricky piece in cyber in terms of how you illustrate the return on investment of all these different tools. That's something that's come up on the podcast before. I mean, I'm curious, thinking about the first piece that you mentioned. You basically said, hey, look, there's multiple different audiences that a company might want to target, and each of these audiences might have a different preference based on their role and kind of what they're used to, right? Something that sticks out to me, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, is if every other company can see that as well, that hey, a cybersecurity professional wants a more traditional piece of marketing, like a LinkedIn ad or something, as opposed to more creative community engagement and open source model with a developer. How do you think about that being natural for the user or the potential customer, but also completely undifferentiated from what everyone else in the market is doing? How do you balance trying to make yourself stand out with a marketing approach that really differentiates you from the other 1,000 companies or more that are trying to get a CISO's attention with a LinkedIn ad?
Yeah. So there are two different elements, right? The first one, what's the channel you should be using to communicate your message? And then second one is how do you differentiate your message, right? So there are two different aspects of marketing, right? So in the first one, make sure that you use the channel that the security professionals or the CISOs are understand or use a lot, right? So that's what you want to do, right? So if you don't use the right channel, then it doesn't even make sense, right? So that's the first core thing, right? Having identified the channel that you want to go through, right? Either if it's a cybersecurity side, if it's a CISO, then the traditional channels, doesn't matter if it's LinkedIn or some of the CISO online publications, etc. That's one element, but the core piece that you have to do is differentiate your messaging, right? So this is where, again, it's very, very critical to have the right brand, right? Or you need to actually sort of make sure that you're driving the right brand awareness. And then second thing, from a differentiated messaging perspective is, look, if you think about the cybersecurity side, that everybody is talking about, look, we help reduce your risk. In some cases, they're we help automate that, right? That's sort of a cliche set of terms that every CISO is used to, right? But the core thing that they're really looking for also is your differentiated value. The more creative we get in terms of sticking, and again, this is the whole 5-second or 10-second rule, right? You've got to go make sure that you as a brand can stick with the security professional, the CISO, in the first 5 or 10 seconds, right? Now that's where the creative creative marketing absolutely comes into play, right? Last thing that I wanted to highlight was this whole notion of creative marketing, right? Again, if you're an early stage company like a seed company or a Series A company, right, you kind of have to differentiate yourself. At the same time, you don't have the budget to go do a Broadway sort of commercial, as an example, right? So just make sure that you're targeting the audience, and from a creative perspective, focus on the non-FUD value, or how are you actually making the life easier, right? And then absolutely be very creative in terms of how you're doing it, right? I would just say that the creativity piece that's where it comes in, which is when you're articulating the message.
Okay, this is a great distinction in terms of thinking about the channel and the message separately in terms of how you're, or where you're trying to distinguish yourself within the kind of marketing supply chain almost. So this is a perfect little crash course on some of these marketing pieces. Appreciate you bearing with me there. Let's go back to your story a little bit more. And I mentioned that I do want to talk about Cloudknox a little bit further. I worked in cloud security for a long time and actually worked with Cloudknox specifically. Loved the whole concept behind what Cloudknox was doing. For listeners who are unfamiliar, It's part of the cloud infrastructure entitlement space, essentially looking at what privileges are actually used in a cloud security environment versus what is actually permissioned, and then trying to correct any user that has been over permissioned. So it's looking at historical data and then right-sizing your permissions to reduce your unnecessary access exposure. Now, I'm curious, you are moving here as a COO rather, for the first time. What is that experience like for you going into this, just kind of much higher leadership role in a much younger company?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that the first thing that, so Balaji and Balaji is the CEO and the founder at Cloudknox. He and I, actually worked together at VMware. So that's our connection way back when, right? So that was way back, like almost like 7 or 8 years ago, right? And then in the early days when he was thinking about starting the company, we ended up spending quite a decent bit of time just trying to brainstorm on the idea, right? I mean, and when he came back and was like, hey, it's time for us to actually scale the company from a go-to-market perspective, and are you actually interested in joining? It was an opportunity that I could not say no to, right? So that was sort of how I actually got into Cloudknox, right? And if you think about it, the key things that I was looking for and I was evaluating is, one is the team itself, right? I mean, obviously I had the advantage of knowing the CEO and the founder and having worked with him at VMware. So there's that comfort in terms of from a human perspective or from a personality perspective, right? Second thing that, for a young company, one of the key things that I wanted to make sure was, the product was adding a lot of value, and there's like a huge roadmap or a very compelling roadmap in terms of the future value that we could provide to our customers, right? Kudos to Balaji for actually articulating that the mission and the vision really well, right? So that convinced me to come in and join as a COO. One of the things that was also very clear was that the product was solid, super early in terms of the traction and adoption. When I joined, when I was actually looking at the company in 2018 and then joined them in early 2019, right? So that was it's a core thing that was attractive, was the fact that we could actually build up a huge market. And when you look at the market, sort of the dynamics, it was pretty clear that more and more companies were going multi-cloud infrastructure, and also there was a huge challenge in terms of, as you said, managing entitlements, right? So one of the first things that we did, right, again, as a CEO, is how do I actually build up the go-to-market, right? Because, you want to scale this company and start getting some of the larger customers, right? So what was pretty clear was, number one is we've got to go work with the industry analysts, right, Gartners of the world, IDC of the world, so that they could start evangelizing the need for for a cloud infrastructure entitlements management solution. So that was the first key decision we made, right? We cannot evangelize the need for this space by ourselves. We need a reputed analyst firm like Gartner, IDC, to actually drive this. Second thing that was also very clear was that we also need partners, right, like AWS, like Azure, to actually also articulate the need for that. So that was basically the first key thing that we sort of decided to actually go drive. The second key thing that we also decided to do early on was, let's not go focus on being a very siloed solution, but more importantly, talk about how can Kim help the overall cloud infrastructure security platform. So in fact, although we actually were helpful in terms of building up the Kim platform or the Kim sort of category, one of the key things that we were also focused on, just like a lot of other vendors, was on the posture management piece too, right? So that, again, why was that critical? Because, again, almost every one of those early prospects we were talking to, they wanted a broader platform, not necessarily a narrow cloud security solution, right? So those core strategies were very critical. And then the third one was making sure that we start scaling up the company by hiring a sales team, right? So that was the third key element. And again, when I say sales team, it was not just, to be very clear, not just a sales team who can drive deals direct, but more importantly, leverage the channel to actually scale up the company, right? Those are the three early decisions. Actually, there's a fourth one. Oh man, I forgot the most important one, just like you said, right? The fourth one was, how do you actually drive a sales motion, right? We came up, so early on, we were trying to sort of convince customers to do a POC, a proof of concept, right? And realized about once we talked about 20 to 30 odd prospects, we realized that when we were positioning our, the overall sort of sales process as like, hey, you have to do a PSC and then we'll show you the value. What we realized was that the word sort of, when we used the word POC, it was actually sort of, there was a knee-jerk reaction and everybody thought this was this massive, massive cumbersome effort. What we realized is, let's go start thinking about actually sort of repositioning that, and let's go do a risk assessment, right? So risk assessment, the word risk assessment implies that if you're the customer, we are coming in, A, it's not going to be heavy lift. B, you will get immediate value because we will give you a snapshot of the risk in your environment, right? So shifting from this notion of driving POCs to a risk assessment was actually a huge deal in terms of driving the business, right? So that was actually the fourth key change we made pretty much in the first 3 to 5 months after we joined, right? And again, kudos to Balaji and the entire team for sort of being comfortable with sort of making so many different changes, right? Now that resulted in like establishment of a KIM category, as you highlighted. B, this whole notion of risk assessment helped us accelerate our deals significantly, not just the pipeline of deals, but helped us close deals quite a bit. And the third one was building this whole notion of a product vision or a platform vision, right? That helped the customers think of us not as a siloed, yet another siloed security tool, but of a broader platform that they can adopt and partner with. Right. So that, again, helped us out a lot. And then working with the channel early on, and then eventually sort of going 100% channel helped us scale. And again, that's been the 4 principles that we use even now at Blueflag Security.
Yeah, that's an awesome overview. And there's pieces of that we're going to come back to in a minute here. The last item that you mentioned around doing the risk assessment versus a POC really resonates for me, actually. I mentioned that I used to do some cloud security work. I was in consulting, and we were doing a lot of like cloud security assessments, right? And
Yes.
Part of our delivery model when we went into a client was using the technology of some of the different product company partners that we worked with. So there was a CSPM tool that we used, and there was a KIM tool that we used, where we would basically do the point-in-time assessment and say, hey, look, here are some of the different misconfigurations we found, and here are some of the like access issues that you have across your environment where like these different users should not have this level of permission. And very commonly, like the whole reason these product companies are doing this is because at the end of the assessment, they say, okay, well, like, should we be using this longer term? And the answer was almost unequivocally yes. And there's lots of incentives there in terms of having other people kind of evangelize your product, right? But that really resonates in terms of where there are some of these tools that can provide that point in time value, the creative ways that you're able to provide them with some sort of output without requiring a full like POC, which to your point has that kind of larger like overhead connotation with some of these teams. So I want to talk about like KIM more broadly at this point, because as it probably makes sense. We'll get to Blueflag. Don't you worry.
No. Good.
This clearly, as it probably becomes obvious through the way I'm talking about this, like I was very bullish on KIM as a category. Cloudknox ultimately had a quite successful exit to Microsoft. Like not many companies you would rather be purchased by, and I don't remember the exact deal amount off the top of my head. What was it? A few $100 million?
It was not disclosed.
It was not disclosed. Okay. Well, that's funny. Maybe I'm just making that number up completely. So with that said, Kim, I feel like has still not like really hit the acceleration point of adoption within the broader ecosystem. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on some of the challenges that Kim Solutions ran into with adoption for all these different enterprises. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so there are a couple of key things, right? So look, I mean, we had I'll just leave it as we had a successful exit by selling quite successful exit selling to Microsoft. But one of there are a couple of things on the Kim side, right, that folks have to think through, right? One is Kim as a standalone category. That honestly is it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, right? And the reason I say that is because if we take a step back, what security teams are looking for is how do I secure my entire cloud infrastructure, right? Not just the identity piece, but also like as you mentioned, right, the posture piece, the workload piece, etc. Right? So what really, I mean, from my perspective, what really happened was a rapid evolution where CSPM plus KIM plus CWPP, all of them converged into a single broader category. That's basically CNAP, right? So absolutely the right market dynamics there, right? So that's literally the first thing that happened, which makes a lot of sense because, and again, this is true across the board, right? I mean, the security teams are sick and tired of these siloed security solutions, which do great job of one little narrow function, but then the security teams have to stitch together this whole notion of risk and threat across multiple of these siloed solutions, right? So the good news is that was, what really happened is that Kim got subsumed into a broader CNAP category, right? So that's one, right? The second thing that is pretty clear is that, if you have to, all of us have to think about how do you operationalize these different solutions, right? It's great to be building either a silo tool or ideally a platform, but then the second thing that most of us, platform companies or vendors have to think about is how can I make it easy for a customer to deploy and operationalize this platform, right? So on the Kim side, this whole notion of least privilege, while it makes sense logically, right, became, it still is a bit of a challenge to actually sort of deploy operationally, right? What I mean by that, right? Let's say you've got, 1,000, identities, all of them have to be right size, right? It's almost like irrational or operationally, it doesn't make sense to actually right size every one of those 1,000 identities, right? Yes, you can right size it, reduce the risk, but then how do you manage them operationally, right? So that was one of the challenges that customers typically had, which is, look, it's not doesn't make sense to right size every identity, right? But then let's go look at it at a group level, a team level, or right size the role, right? So at that point in time, by definition, it's sort of a best fit approach, right? And one of the things that more and more companies should try and do is how do I help any company operationalize it at that group level, team level, or at the role level, right? Now that's something that hasn't necessarily been historically articulated, right? So that's what I would say is that, like, look, I mean, there are two different dynamics that have happened there, right? So subsumed by a larger category, that's actually great for the customers. And the second one, again, learning for me, learning for all of us is how do you make sure you can, you can operationalize the deployment of the platform. And again, it's the crawl, walk, run approach, right? But show that value, right? Show that value when you can operationalize it, right? So my thing is like the reason I bring these two up was because Kim as Kim or Kim platforms suffer more of this latter, right? The first one, which is being subsumed, is the absolutely the right thing for the broader industry. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And part of the reason I'm asking so much about the Kim space and your experience at Cloudknox is because I think this actually ties in quite well to what we're going to talk about a little bit more with Blueflag, right? Where there's a lot of parallels in terms of some of the challenges that you're facing, both in terms of kind of like evangelizing a new market. And you talked about the importance of Gartner analysts there. And yeah, some of the challenges in terms of operationalizing it or how it fits into the broader tool stack that exists within the developer ecosystem as opposed to the cloud security ecosystem. So let's go there a little bit more. how did Blueflag actually come about in the first place? You're doing this work with cloud identity rightsizing, and at some point you decide, hey, it's not just these cloud identities that need the problem solved for, but also all these developers that have over-permissioned accounts to like deploy new assets and push code within like a DevOps world. Tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, so when we first started thinking about the problem statement, what was there were a few things that were pretty clear, right? Number one is there's a huge amount of focus on making the entire software development process or the SDLC process much more secure, right? Secure by design, secure by default, what have you. But there was a lot of emphasis on that. Why? Because there was more and more risk being introduced during the development process, not necessarily post development or when it's getting deployed, right? So it was pretty clear that the overall development process of the SDLC process was a soft underbelly in terms of risk or from a security perspective. Right. So now that was number one, pretty clear, right? I mean, and then how did we come to the conclusion? It was just by talking to literally I don't know, like 25 to 50 odd CISOs or security professionals, once I left Microsoft, right? So that's how we actually came up with that whole notion of like, we've got to go protect the entire development environment, right? So the second thing, because of the risk, right? The second thing that was also very clear is if you can take a step back and sort of say like, okay, our goal as a company is to protect the entire development environment. And then let's go look at some of the solutions that are out there, which quote unquote, protect the development environment. So quickly came to the realization that, all the different solutions, doesn't matter if it is SCA, SaaS, DAST, or even SPM, they fundamentally have the approach of looking at code, identifying vulnerabilities in the code, and then trying to correlate it and fix the problem. But the core thing is it is a reactive approach, and they're only looking at one attack vector, right? Again, I go back to when you think about the overall development environment, what was aha moment was like, oh, nobody is actually looking at that point in time, almost 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago, was two other attack vectors, which were actually introducing almost 3/4 of the risk, right? And the two attack vectors were, misconfigurations and hand posture with the development tools, right? Nobody was really looking at it and then sort of fixing it. And then the other one, which was the risk associated with developers, right? And one of the risk happens to be that every developer is over entitled, right? But then there's also other risk like developer hygiene is not maintained well by pretty much every organization, right? And then the third one is the behavior, right? It's not necessarily malicious, the developer behavior, but there's a ton of risk because of the combination of overly entitled developer and misconfigurations in the different tool sets, right? So that's basically where we came up with this whole idea of building a single platform again, right? Which looks at risk holistically across the entire development and across the entire SDLC process. And then so that was the first thing, right? Which was like, got to go build a single platform to look at that. Second thing that we realized when we took this approach was fundamentally what our security teams want is the ability to stop it at the root cause, right? Identify the root cause and stop and protect the entire development environment, right? So again, the aha moment was, okay, vulnerabilities don't magically appear in code. Somebody has to bring it in, right? Or somebody is bringing it in. And almost always when you sort of think about like, okay, let me keep shifting left, what you realize is that invariably it's a developer who tends to bring in a lot of these vulnerabilities. And again, by the way, when I said developer, a couple of things to sort of note. It's not just a human developer. It could also be a non-human identity or a service account, etc. Right? So the aha moment is like, okay, got to go sort of fix the problem or identify the root cause and fix the problem there. Right? So that was a second key sort of guiding principle for us to actually get the company started, right? And there are a couple of other principles that we realized as we started building the company, like for example, early design partners, they're like, look, this is actually phenomenal, but help us get value in the first month or couple of months, right? So that's where we actually then started this whole concept of giving our customers this whole notion of templatized policies that can be customized, right? So why did we do that? So that they can get value almost immediately, right? So that's the third one, right? And then the fourth one was this whole notion of not just providing insights. I laugh when I tell this, like, look, we don't want to be a wisdom giving platform. There are enough of those, right? The more important thing is how can you help them fix the problem, right? So remediation was a core and continues to be a core essence of what we build in the platform, right? And this all ties back to compliance, which is really what started the whole problem, right? Hey, I want to be secure by design. I want to be secure by default, and hence tie everything that we're doing back to, like the NIST 800 framework, or pick any of the other compliance frameworks. So that's how we actually started, the journey in terms of how we actually evolved the platform from the beginning to, like, in terms of like identifying the problem, and then how did we sort of build it into a broader platform.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the kind of identity technology approach, because like you mentioned, there's some similarities between your previous work at Cloudknox and your work at Blueflag, where you're saying, hey, we want to reduce the access risk of these different users in these different environments. But I think my sense is there's a fairly fundamentally different approach that you have to take for each of those environments, because with cloud, you say, hey, this user's over permissioned and they're not actually using those permissions. And so we can go ahead and pull it. Whereas part of what you just described with developers is, hey, a developer might be over permissioned, and that developer might also be using those permissions fairly frequently in terms of like pulling in new dependencies or spinning up new infrastructure with insecure configurations or something like that, right? So it's not that you can just identify, hey, this person has these permissions that they're not using, it's unnecessary access, but rather that they might be over permissioned and need to be restricted a little bit further. How did you think about like solving that delineation and difference?
Yeah, so this is where, again, right, it goes back to you've got to go build what we call an activity intelligence framework, right? But the point there is exactly like you cannot just look at right-sizing unused permissions, right? That's part of it, but then you can't necessarily do that with all the time with developers, right? So what you have to look at is what kind of actions are they taking, what kind of activity are they doing, and is it risky, is it not risky? You sort of have to provide more and more context in terms of what developers are doing, right? So again, this is where context is king, and that's basically what we need to do in terms of even fixing the problem, right? And this is where we have this whole concept of like, look at what action any given developer has taken on any given development asset, right? So that's very critical. And at the same time, it has to understand the context, right? Understand the context of what the developer is doing, and also understand the context in terms of what is the criticality of those assets, right? So we've actually built that as a framework, and that's where there's a huge, huge difference between a traditional CIEM solution versus what you need to do to have a much more of a robust platform-based approach to fixing the risk, or to identifying and sort of remediating the risk in the development environment. Right? Hopefully that sort of makes it pretty clear why this is a significantly more complex problem to solve, and hence the need for this more platform or more of a holistic approach there.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I mean, you're a couple of years in now, and I imagine some of this you kind of figured out more and more on the fly as you were building, and started with iterating the product and going and speaking with those like 50 CISOs that you'd mentioned previously. There's an interesting part of the journey of Blueflag, though, that I do really want to touch on, which is you started as a kind of entrepreneur in residence. I think it was Maverick Ventures that you were actually working with. And tell me a little bit more about that experience. I haven't heard too much from folks who've gone through this process. What was that like for you? What was the value that you really got out of it? And what are your thoughts reflecting back on it?
Yeah, so I mean, I it was actually super, super useful for me to be EIR or entrepreneur residence at Maverick Ventures, right? What that helped us do, between, my co-founder and I, Ken Schneider, who was my co-founder, one of the things it helped us do is early on is let's not focus on building the product. Let's go focus on getting the validation from customers. Let's go focus on building, let's just call it a Figma-based approach of showing them the value, right? Let's not even write a line of code, right? And the reason why that was critical was because it helped us validate the need without necessarily spending a ton of engineering time early on, right? So we could do that because we were an entrepreneur residence and we were leveraging Maverick Ventures network and we were leveraging, and again, we actually found it much, much, much more easier for us to have the ability to talk to CISOs because we were entrepreneurs in resident who were starting to build a company or build a platform, right? So again, for folks who are trying to sort of take a slightly different approach, which is like, let's go talk to a bunch of CISOs, validate there's a need, right, across like 20 to 50 CISOs, I would certainly encourage to go down the route of a EIR, right? Because that helps you, sort of get to 30 to 50 CISOs, helps you validate and more importantly, iterate rapidly in terms of what you think your platform or what you think your company should be all about, right? And hence the product that you're building, right? So now that is where Maverick Ventures was super, super helpful, right? And then once we had a reasonably good understanding of what the product should look like, that's when we ended up building up a prototype, right? So help me sort of go again, I go back to when you're starting to build a company. Look, there are bunch of ideas we all have as entrepreneurs, right? It's super, super critical early on that you just don't roll up your sleeve and build it out. It's very critical to validate which one of those ideas can actually become a business or has a potential of becoming a business, right? And then look, seeing is believing. When you visualize and you show some of these things to the CISOs, you get immediate reaction as opposed to just theoretically talking about your idea, right? It's important, but it's a small part of the overall storytelling, right? So again, that's where again, being a EIR helps you expand and get to a bunch of CISOs and validate what you're building, right? So that's where again, I would, if I have opportunity to do it again, I would absolutely again do it, and I highly recommend folks to take the EIR approach.
That's an awesome overview. Candidly, I didn't realize that such a core part of that EIR role, or at least the responsibility from the VC firm, is connecting you with CISOs. I mean, this is probably what I've talked about most on the show. Like the most common thread over the last 4 years has been the most successful founders are the ones that talk to their customers the most before they go out and start building. So many awesome examples going back through previous episodes of people who had 50, 100 conversations with CISOs before they actually committed to an idea, where you're building these potential prospective customers later down the line. You're getting a better sense of the specific problems that these folks are dealing with and whether or not your solution is going to address it, how you should be architecting your solution within their different constraints. So if that's what you're saying an EIR provides, then yeah, all of a sudden I'm a mega fan of the whole EIR program. So I love it. Now I want to tie back this thread that we've kind of talked about throughout this conversation, where we talked about your experience with marketing more generally. We talked about some of the different channels that someone can go through. We talked about the differences between security and developers in terms of how they like to be reached. And we talked about your experience with security at Cloudknox. Now at Blueflag, you're dealing with a kind of like hybrid scenario, right? Where security is maybe the team that cares about it most. You can correct me on who your chief buyer is, but I'm imagining that security cares about it most and is probably paying. But at the end of the day, your users in some ways are the developers, because they might be the ones that are like interfacing with the tool most directly or having their access influenced by the Blueflag tool and potentially impacting their workflows. So as we think through this kind of marketing challenge that you're dealing with. Was there any like epiphany moment you had during the Blueflag journey where you said, okay, this was maybe like my previous view in terms of how to best target this audience, but then like something clicked for you and all of a sudden you noticed like way more success with reaching your target audience, or maybe you changed who you thought your prospective customer was, anything like that?
Yeah, so early on, because we are trying to secure the entire development environment, right? One of the key things was perhaps we should also go and talk to the VP of engineering or the CTO or the development team, right? So early on, we were trying to do sort of a hybrid approach of like, look, I'm not 100% sure if it is the security team that should be actually buying this or should it be the dev teams, right? Because a lot of the times what happens is that dev teams have a very huge say in terms of which security tools to buy, right? Like if you think about sneaks of the world, right, the primary target has always been the development community, right? So early on, what we were trying to say, we thought we had to sell to both those different audiences, right? And so we had this hybrid approach. What we soon realized was that look, I mean, unless you have a non-security value proposition for the engineering team, it's to some extent was adding more and more friction to the sales process. Why do I say that, right? So the number one thing that the engineering team cares about is, does this help me increase the velocity by which I can deliver the platform, deliver the features in the product, right? That's really what the engineering team cares about the most, right? If and again, right, and obviously they want to create secure code, but fundamentally what they want to do is they want any platform that we've built or any security company has built, they should not add any friction, right? So the aha moment for us first was like, great, by talking to the engineering team, what we realized is two things, right? Number one is if you're inline or if you're adding any friction to the development process, invariably, even if the security team loves you, it will not get deployed. It will be shelfware, right? So take an approach where you're not adding friction to the development team, right? So that was the first thing, right? Second thing that we realized was that if you have this hybrid approach of selling where you're trying to sell to the security value proposition to the engineering team and you're trying to drive to the security team, you just it's a very challenging approach for a early stage company, right? And what we realized was that most of the security decisions, at least for us, right, were being driven by the security as long as you're not adding any friction, right? So the core was, again, it's not rocket science, honestly, but the core thing that when we designed the platform was, let's not add any friction to the overall development process. Let's go focus on building the value, the security value, right? And then along the way, we also realized is because we are taking a much more of an activity intelligence approach in terms of the overall framework, the underlying framework for our platform. What we also realize is that we can add a ton of value, right, to the engineering team, and that's something that will continue to enhance, right? So now all of a sudden going from like only focusing on security value, right? Yes, we'll provide security value. That's where the budget will come from, but also more and more what our customers are asking us to do is, can you also leverage your platform to help the engineering team identify some of the challenges they may have in terms of the velocity at which they're developing products, right? Or what's the, how are the best teams operating? How can they better enhance some of the challenges they may be having in terms of insecure code practices or development practices, right? So interesting enough, that's something that we'll also be focused on. Hopefully that sort of, you'll see that early on we looked at both of them. We pulled back, only focused on security. And now the security team is actually sort of helping us identify value, which are more interesting for the engineering team, right? So it's kind of like a full circle moment, but the biggest difference is that make sure that you give value to the engineering team that they need, which is more than just security. And then for the security, focus on the security side, it's like, look, again, it expands repeating myself, right? Do not just provide insights, help them do the job better, which is help them in the remediation side, right? Again, it helps both security team and also helps the security team give the right insights and helps accelerate the overall development process too.
I think this goes back to just a really early theme that you mentioned in this episode, right? Which is understand who your audience is and like reevaluate that. You had a hypothesis early on, and then you challenged it a little bit later, and then you challenged that again. So even after you like thought that you maybe had corrected yourself and figured it out, you're still thinking about, hey, how can we better reach these different target audiences, and constantly assessing who your target buyer is and the best way to go ahead and reach them. So I think that's a perfect place to wrap here. Raj, this is awesome. Really appreciate the time and you telling a little bit more of your story across a lot of different capacities and really interesting companies within the ecosystem here. So thank you.
It was absolutely a pleasure talking to you, and thank you again for inviting me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can write to me at kyle@secureventures.io. I'm Kyle McNulty, and you've been listening to Secure Ventures.